Hi guys! We are back again with Chapter 20 of The Borrowers. I hope you're excited. I know I am. I can't wait to see what happens next. Let's see. Chapter 20, our very last chapter. But, exclaimed Kate, didn't he see them come out? No, Mrs. Driver came along then, in a flurry of annoyance, because they were late for the train. She bustled him into the cab because she wanted to go back again, she said, as fast as she could, to be in at the death. Driver was like that. Kate was silent a moment, looking down. So that is the end, she said at last. Yes, said Mrs. May, it could be, or the beginning. But, Kate raised a worried face, perhaps they didn't escape through the grating. Oh, they escaped all right, said Mrs. May lightly. But how do you know? I just know, said Mrs. May. But how did they get across those fields, with the cows and things, and the crows? They walked, I suppose. The Hendrearys did it. People can do anything when they have a mind to. But poor Homily, she'd be so upset. Yes, she was upset, said Mrs. May. And how would they know the way? By the gas pipe, said Mrs. May. There was a kind of ridge all along, through the spinney and across the fields. You see, when men dig a trench and put a pipe in it, all the earth they've dug out, doesn't quite fit when they put it back. The ground looks different. But poor Homily, she didn't have her tea, or her furniture, or her carpets, or anything. Do you suppose they took anything? Oh, people always grab something, said Mrs. May shortly. The oddest things sometimes, if you've read about shipwrecks. She spoke hurriedly, as though she were tired of the subject. Do be careful, child. Not gray next to pink. You'll have to unpick it. But, went on Kate in a despairing voice as she picked up the scissors, Homily would hate to arrive there all poor and destitute in front of Loopy. Destitute, said Mrs. May patiently. And Loopy wasn't there, remember? Loopy never came back. And you know what Homily would do? Can't you see her? She'd be in her element. She would tie on her apron at once and cry, "These poor silly men!" And she'd bustle and fuss and cook and clean and make them wipe their feet when they came in. On what? Asked Kate. On a piece of moss, of course, laid down at the door. Were they all boys? Kate asked after a moment. Yes, the harpsichords and clocks, and they'd spoil Arrietty dreadfully. What did they eat? Did they eat caterpillars, do you think? Oh, goodness, child, of course they didn't. They had a wonderful life, all that Arrietty had ever dreamed of. They could live very well. Badger sets were almost like villages, full of passages and chambers and storehouses. They could gather hazelnuts and beechnuts and chestnuts. They could gather corn, which they could store and grind into flour, just as humans do. It was all there for them. They didn't even have to plant it. And they had honey. And they could make elderflower tea and lime tea. And they had hips and haws and blackberries and sloes and wild strawberries. The boys could fish at the stream, and a minnow to them would be as big as a mackerel is to you. They had birds' eggs, any amount of them, for custards and cakes and omelets. You see, they would know where to look for things. And they had greens and salads, of course. Think of a salad made of those tender shoots of young hawthorn. Bread and cheese, we used to call it, with sorrel and dandelion and a sprinkling of thyme and wild garlic. Homily was a good cook, remember? It wasn't for nothing that the clocks had lived under the kitchen. But the danger, cried Kate, the weasels and the crows, and the stoats, and all those things. Yes, agreed Mrs. May, of course there was danger. There's danger everywhere. But no more for them than for many human beings. At least they didn't have wars. And what about the early settlers in America, and those people who farm in the middle of big game country in Africa, and on the edge of the jungles in India? They get to know the habits of the animals. Few animals kill for the sake of killing. Even rabbits know when a fox isn't hunting. They will run quite near him when he's full fed and lazing in the sun. These were boys, remember. They would learn to hunt for the pot and how to protect themselves. I don't suppose Arrietty and Homily would wander far afield. Arrietty would, said Kate. Yes, agreed Mrs. May, laughing. I suppose Arrietty might. Do they have meat? Said Kate. Yes, sometimes. But borrowers are borrowers, not killers, I think, said Mrs. May. that if a stoat, say, killed a partridge, they would borrow a leg. And if a fox killed a rabbit, they would use the fur. Yes, for rugs and things. Supposing, said Kate, when they had a little roast, they skinned haws and baked them. Would they taste like browned potatoes? Perhaps, said Mrs. May. But they couldn't cook in the Badger set. I suppose they cooked out of doors. How would they keep warm then in the winter? Do you know what I think? Said Mrs. May. She laid down her work and leaned forward a little. I think they didn't live in the Badger set at all. I think they used it, with all its passages and storerooms, as a great honeycomb of an entrance hall. None but they would know the secret way through the tunnels which led at last to their home. Borrowers love passages, and they love gates, and they love to live a long way from their own front door. Where would they live, then? I was wondering, said Mrs. May, about the gas pipe. Oh, yes, cried Kate, I could see what you mean. The soil's all soft and sandy up there. I think they'd go right through the Badger set and dig out a circular chamber, level with the gas pipe. And off this chamber, all around it, there'd be little rooms, like cabins. And I think, said Mrs. May, that they'd bore 3 little pinholes in the gas pipe. One would be so tiny that you could hardly see it, and one that would always be alight. The other 2 would have stoppers in them, which when they wanted to light the gas, they would pull out. They would light the bigger ones from the small burner. That's where they'd cook, and that would give them light. But would they be so clever? But they are clever, Mrs. May assured her, very clever, much too clever to live near a gas pipe and not use it. They're borrowers, remember? But they'd want a little air hole. Oh, said Mrs. May quickly, they did have one. But how do you know? Asked Kate. Because once, when I was up there, I smelled hot paper. Oh, cried Kate excitedly. She twisted round and knelt up on the hassock. So you did go up there. So that's how you know. You saw them too. No, said Mrs. May, drawing back a little in her chair. I never saw them. Never. But you went up there. You know something. I can see you know. Yes, I went up there, said Mrs. May, stared back into Kate's eager face, hesitant. She seemed almost a little guilty. Well, she conceded, I'll tell you, for what it's worth. When I went to stay in that house, it was just before Aunt Sophie went into the nursing home. I knew the place was going to be sold, so again, Mrs. May hesitated, almost shyly. Well, I took all the furniture out of the dollhouse and put it in a pillowcase and took it up there. I bought things too out of my pocket money. Tea and coffee beans and salt and pepper and cloves and a great packet of lump sugar. And I took the whole lot of little pieces of silk which were over from making a patchwork quilt. And I took them some fish bones for needles. I took the tiny thimble I got in a Christmas pudding and a whole collection of scraps and cracker things I'd had in a chocolate box. But you never saw them. No, I never saw them. I sat for hours against the bank below the hawthorn hedge. It was a lovely bank, twined with twisted hawthorn roots and riddled with sandy holes, and there were wood violets and primrose and early campion. From the top of the bank you could see for miles across the fields. You could see the woods and the valleys and the twisting lanes. You could see the chimneys of the house. Perhaps it was the wrong place. I don't think so. Sitting there in the grass, half dreaming and watching beetles and ants, I found an oak apple. It was smooth and polished and dry, and there was a hole bored in one side of it, and the slice off the top. The teapot, exclaimed Kate. I think so. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find the quill spout. I called then down all the holes, as my brother had done, but no one answered. Next day when I went up there, the pillowcase had gone. And everything in it? Yes, everything. I searched the ground for yards around it, in case there might be a scrap of silk or a coffee bean, but there was nothing. Of course, somebody passing might have just picked it up and carried it away. That was the day, said Mrs. May, that I smelled hot pot. "And which was the day," asked Kate, "that you found Arrietty's diary?" Mrs. May laid down her work. "Kate," she began in a startled voice, and then uncertainly she smiled. "What makes you say that?" Her cheeks had become quite pink. "I guess," said Kate, "I knew there was something you wouldn't tell me, like reading somebody's diary." "It wasn't the diary," said Mrs. May hastily, but her cheeks had become even pinker. "It was the book called Memoranda, the book with blank pages. That's where she'd written it, and it wasn't on that day I found it, but 3 weeks later, before I left." Kate was silent, staring at Mrs. May. After a while she drew a long breath. "Then that proves it," she said finally, "underground chamber and all." "Not quite," said Mrs. May. "So this is the oak apple that was left behind. I think at least, it's like the bottom half of their teapot." "Why not?" asked Kate. "Arrietty used to make her E's like little half-moons with a stroke in the middle." "Well," said Kate. Mrs. May laughed and took her work again. "My brother did too." So what they're showing is Arrietty taught her little brother how to read and how to write. That's pretty fun, right? Then that proves it, she said finally, underground chamber and all. "Not quite," said Mrs. May. "Why not?" asked Kate. "Arrietty used to make her E's in little half-moons with a stroke in the middle." "Well," said Kate. Mrs. May laughed and took up her work again. "My brother did too." Arrietty taught her brother to read. That's really cool. Alright guys, this is the end of The Borrowers. If you've really enjoyed this book, and I hope you have, because I certainly did, you are more than welcome to read the next books in the series. In fact, there's multiple. We can even check this out. See, look, this is the first book that we just read, The Borrowers. Then there's The Borrowers Afield, The Borrowers Afloat, The Borrowers Aloft, and The Borrowers Avenged. And then Mary Norton also wrote 3 other books called Bedknob and Broomstick, Poor Stainless, and Are All the Giants Dead? If you want to read more about The Borrowers, you can read the next book in the series, The Borrowers Afield. If you do, tell me all about it. I'd love to hear about what you read. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye!